Some operations are only available within a standalone version of View. And at any time, what you can do is go to File and open the scene in Standalone View. What it'll do is take the current scene and open it up in the Standalone program. If the scene hasn't been saved, it will open a temporary file. If you're using the non-incorporated scenes, what you'll want to do is save any changes you've made to the scene. So go to File and Save from the xStream menu. And then you can just go over and open up View Standalone, even with it still open within xStream, and make changes, save them, and then go File and reload Scene from File, which will update the scene. So some of the major operations that are available in the standalone, I'm going to go ahead and turn off my frame guides so we can see a bit more of the scene. Obviously the OpenGL is a huge improvement over the integrated version. The ability to see the sky is one very large difference. And the ability to preview the clouds as well. So in File Options, you can see under OpenGL Atmosphere Preview, you can select to show the planet object, which is just a kind of a two-dimensional object plane that faces the camera, lens flares, and then clouds. So if we add a cloud layer, what it's going to do is then render within the viewport. And this does make it a little bit easier to really see what's going on with the atmosphere without having to do any extensive renders. An additional feature which is really nice is whenever you're working with clouds, and what I did was just double-click on the top border of the main camera view, and that takes any of the views and makes them full screen. But if I zoom out, and I'm just using the scroll to do that, we can see where the cloud layer is currently showing in relation to the scene, and that's not available in xStream or in the integrated version. So it is really nice to be able to place clouds that way. And if we add additional cloud layers, you'll be able to see exactly where they're showing up and whether or not they're overlapping. If we reduce the altitude a little, and make them so they intersect, you can see a darkening of cloud layers to see that they are intersecting. And then the OpenGL preview updates. So those are some really nice features for modifying the clouds. Now I am using the Shader 4 model, which provides the best OpenGL quality. It also provides real-time shadows. So for now, what I'm going to do, just to prevent the atmosphere from updating continuously as I move throughout the scene, because it will update as you move through the fog. I'm going to load in an infinite terrain. And I also want to note that the infinite terrains, every time you load in a preset, it should give you a different terrain. So right now the rough preset is loaded in. If I right-click and reload the preset and replace it with a new one, it has a built-in seed that will update and generate a new terrain type. So it is somewhat random. If we edit the object, we can also go down to the lower right and click New, and it might change the preset in some cases, when you click New. Otherwise, what you can do is go to the Procedural tab, edit the function, and you can just change the seed, which is really just a modification of the vector origin of the terrain fractal. So modifying these numbers will give you a different look for the terrain. Modifying the X and Y with the Z-axis up, in this case, will shift the terrain fractals just across the surface. Modifying the Z will provide the largest amount of change. So also the preview and the OpenGL preview of infinite terrains and any sort of procedural terrain and displaced water surface is going to look much better in view in the standalone. So sometimes it's just a lot easier with these massive terrains to work with them within the standalone if you need to see a little bit of better quality. And massive amount of increase in quality for just a regular terrain. We could also go to the sea level, which is currently not set to render. Change this over to hidden from this little pull down in the aspect tab. And it does look like that's not working. And I do want to make sure in the options that I turn off clip objects under first horizontal plane. What's going to happen is it's going to clip and cut out the geometry from the view. But now we can see the terrain, and if we take a look, I described earlier about how when you lift the terrain it extends. So if I grab or lift the camera, the terrain extends. So I'm going to select the main camera and lift it up. And now it is much larger than it was before. Go to my options. And even though spherical scene is not turned on, my atmosphere is bending. So I'm going to go up my display, and there's an option for the spherical display, even though spherical scene isn't turned on. That might be a bug. Either that or they did change the way the cloud system works, because the terrain itself is not manipulated. It doesn't look like it's really changing, but the clouds are. Another thing that the standalone is really nice for is the ability to really kind of quickly see a preview of what the scene looks like. You can render in the preview mode and just render the viewport. It gives you a very quick estimate, just kind of seeing what the scene looks like. You can also take a look in the viewer over on the right, turning auto update on and off, and just I usually keep it off and then just click on it when I want an update. It's a nice way to edit atmospheres and get a very quick response to see what changes are being made. So even with just a small preview, we can go to the atmosphere editor and we can adjust the lighting and see a preview of the overall lighting in the OpenGL for the main atmosphere. Clouds will also update. So sometimes it is a little nicer to switch over to the standalone, make certain changes, and then you can save the file out, reload it within Lightwave. There's also the painter, which is only available within the standalone at the moment because of limitations with Lightwave's SDK. And we can access this up at the top, selecting the xStream or Ecosystem Painter. If it ever gets integrated into Lightwave, it will be called the xStream Painter, which is what it's called in other applications. What you can do is add rocks, plants, objects, just like any other ecosystem. So I'm going to go ahead and load in a few of my tropical plants. And whenever you have the shader 4 model turned on, under the display options, you get the option to use the shaded billboard mode, which uses normal maps in order to generate the OpenGL preview. So it provides a much more accurate preview of the plants. And I just want to go over how the Ecosystem Painter works, so you can get an idea how to use it. There's a couple of different modes. Up at the top, we can do a single instance, which is the first option for the tool. And down at the bottom, we have a Paint What option. A bit of everything will select randomly from the list of loaded objects in the ecosystem population, and the only selected item will choose from one of the specific plants. So with single instance mode on, and we click, it's going to select randomly from that list and create those objects. And with single instance, it's just going to create one. I also want to note that with the view unit set to 1 meter, that the scene is very large, and modifying some of these smaller objects and small plants, you have a very fast movement of the camera, and most of the primary camera controls are controlled over here on the right, where we can rotate around, can pan through the scene, move in and out, and then the focal's up on top. Anytime you need to slow down the controls, you can hold on the control key on the keyboard, which will slow the movement and allow you to be a little more precise about how you're moving the camera. Within the viewport, you can also move around, right-click to kind of pan, shift, and right-click to pan around the scene, or shift the camera. And I usually just use the zoom or the wheel on the mouse in order to move in and out. The slowdown only works within the main camera controls, however. I'm going to go ahead and lift the sun up into the sky a little higher. We can see the display a little bit better. Another thing that's nice is we do have a auto update on the sun position, so that some of these commands do go a little bit quicker. If we switch over to the brush mode, we can paint in our objects. Doesn't look like the density is high enough. So what we can do is turn off the limit density, and we do have a readout on the top that tells us how many instances have been created. You can at any time clear out everything. We could reduce the brush flow if we don't want so many plants being created. If you're having issues painting in the perspective view or having issues basically with too many plants that look exactly the same, one known issue is when you're painting in the perspective view, sometimes the objects are being created so quickly that the solid growth and the random plant generation is not working. So that is one thing to pay attention to. It's not an issue in any of the other viewports that you're painting in. Mainly the top viewport is going to work the best, and sometimes it's just a good idea to use the perspective view to kind of give you an idea of where something's at. I just created 3 plants, and they all look exactly the same. So it does not look like any sort of rotation was added or the growth was working. So that's one thing to watch out for. So if you have plants painted or rocks or any sort of object you have loaded in. You can also switch to the eraser mode and erase anything. If you want to erase just a specific item, you go to Only Selected Item, select the plant you want to delete, and it'll only delete that object that is in the scene. You can change the brush radius and size, or radius and flow. And then over on the right, we also have the Drive with Pressure options. So if you're using a Wacom tablet or other pressure-sensitive tablet, you do have the ability to drive any one of these with the pressure and control them. Rotation is kind of a random setting. Whether or not it's going to show in the OpenGL, I'm not sure. There was a problem in the past where the rotation was not showing, and all the plants still looked like they were up. So maybe that's just not working at the moment. But it does allow you to rotate around the objects. You can also do an overall color change to the plants. So make a green variation of that purple plant, and that's going to overlay a color on top of that. Then there's the Color and Scaling tool, so we can adjust both scale and color at the same time to add tones and hues to the objects. Change the color, say yellow, and now it's going to scale and make them a little yellow. You can turn off scaling, just color the objects. Turn on scaling and just make the objects larger or smaller. So if we reduce the scale, we can move these down, reducing the scale. Switch over to a bit of everything, and it's going to affect every object. And then you can also go into the display options, and if you want to show full quality instances, first what I'm going to do is just clear this out, make something a little bit lighter. Go to display, allow full quality in your camera, and now these are going to be the full geometry objects. And that option is also available for a regular ecosystem. So I'm going to clear this out. Go into the terrain, add an ecosystem, and before I add any objects, a cool thing you can do to switch over, because I don't want to have to go through and load all these again, what I'm going to do is with a bit of everything selected, I'm going to just brush in an assortment of objects, and it should have everything painted in. Go to the instance ecosystem instance selector, select all, and move these instances over to what would be the material ecosystem on the terrain, but I think because it hasn't been initialized yet, it's not available. So I'm going to open the terrain, just add one plant that's going to load very quickly, and I can remove that later. Populate, go back to the instance selector with all those items still selected, and move the instances to that grass terrain. Go back to the terrain, edit the material. I'm going to remove the plum tree, and now all of those items are in the list, and we can populate and create an ecosystem out of those. So we have the shaded billboard mode on, and we can see a nice quality of what the plants are going to look like. And this is still just the shaded billboard. It's not the full geometry, even though it looks pretty close to it. You can also allow full quality in your camera if you want to see the full mesh versions, and then you can set the radius from the camera in which those are shown. So that will update, and as you move away, they will all go back to the shaded billboard, zoom back in, and they start to switch over to the mesh. So with trees, ecosystems, plants, that's a really nice option to have, to be able to switch over and just see a nice preview. Another option that is available only within the standalone is the ability to modify the materials on the plants and the plants themselves without having to load the actual plant in and save a new species. At the moment, these plants are only loaded as part of the ecosystem. In the integrated version of xStream, there's no way to access or edit that plant. So within the standalone, we can go over to the library tab over here on the right. We can also collapse these panels so we can see that a little better. And we can see all of those tropical plants. If I select number 37, and then go down here to the lower left, we can edit the object. And that's going to open up the plant editor. We can make changes. We can also edit the material. And it may not refresh the OpenGL for the color. Now when I click OK, it's going to apply that change. We're also going to get an updated rendered preview. And right now it's preparing the ecosystem. So it does look like it is going to refresh the OpenGL preview and then repopulate and change those objects. So that option is only available in the standalone. Otherwise, in order to complete that and make those kind of modifications within the integrated version, you will need to load in the plant manually. So if you go over to the left where the little plant icon is, you can right-click, select a plant, and we'll just use that tropical plant. Right-click, edit the object to open the plant editor, or you can double-click on the object, and then you can make changes. And when you're done making these changes, you do need to save a new species. So up at the top, you can select Save Plant Species, which is going to create a new plant object. Once you save it out, which is a .veg file, you will need to go into your ecosystem, remove that object, and then load in the new one. So we would remove this one and add plant and then choose the new variation that was saved. The only problem with that is you do lose the current placement for all of the plants that are within the ecosystem, and it will create a new distribution. So having access to the standalone, it really ends up being easier to complete certain commands without losing the look of the current scene. If you switch over to the Links tab, which is all the way on the right, it's going to show every single texture map in the scene. So these plants are not loaded into the scene, but we can see all of the texture maps from the ecosystem. So we can go in and individually replace any of those texture maps for custom ones. We can see the alphas. I've got bumps, highlights, and color maps for each of the remaining 3 plants. And one of the plants has a lot of extra variations and highlight maps with it. If you go to the Materials tab, you can also access the materials directly without having to edit the instance. You can just double-click and it'll automatically open up the ecosystem or object material. And that way you don't have to load in those objects. So those are some pretty nice commands that are available. Earlier in the training I mentioned and was talking about the multipass options and how you can set up layer masks. Right now we have one layer within the scene, but if you want to set up a mask for additional objects and be able to separate them within the multipass, what you can do is within the main tab, the Objects tab, you can add in a layer. So now we have a new layer. Now I can add additional objects to the scene, just add a terrain, We'll go ahead and move that over. And now when we go to the multipass option, that layer mask is available, and any object and ecosystem tied to that object is going to be available to render out as a separate mask within the multipass. So that is also only achievable within the standalone version. Although Metaclouds are available within xStream integrated, it can fill your scene with a lot of different spheres, and if you like to use the lower selection menu to choose objects, that's going to be kind of a pain. You also get a better OpenGL preview when you load Metaclouds. You're just going to right click on that cloud icon. You can load in a Metacloud, and we can see that object. So sometimes editing these, placing them is a little bit easier to switch to the standalone. I do typically suggest that Metaclouds are one of the final parts of a scene if you're going to have them. In Lightwave, I'm going to go ahead, Object, Create Metacloud from Preset. We can select a cloud, add that in. So it's going to generate a random cloud from that preset. So now when we take a look, it's going to fill our list with a lot of different spheres. So selecting of objects is best done with the scene editor, where we can select that cumulus object or the individual spheres making up the Metacloud and modify and edit it that way. So it is definitely possible. But you don't get the preview, and then once again, if you do like to choose using the menu down here without having to create any extra sets or separate the scene, you don't have to worry about all the filled objects, and using the scene editor is much easier. But either way, it works quite well. I like to just switch to the standalone. It's a little bit easier to place some of these objects and see where they're at. So back in the standalone, I also want to show you, create a new scene, that the preview of procedural terrains and the OpenGL is also a bit more complex. And depending on the scale of the object, it will update and create sort of zones, and the more you zoom in to these objects, it will update and create a refreshed preview. And it can be a little bit easier to define things, but within Lightwave, of course, you can just edit the object wherever the camera is placed, and then it will also increase the detail. And one last option is macros and Python scripts. Python scripts have to be loaded within the standalone, so you can go to Automation, run a Python script, and then you can load in any of those files. You can also show the Python console, set up macros and record macros, which can be done up here at the top or from the menu. Macros give you the ability to use repeatable events and apply it to different objects. So if I record one right now, I'm going to, with the terrain already selected, scale it and rotate it and move it a little, and then stop. Now I'll just keep this called new macro, save it, and now if I take any other object in the scene, make that a little bit larger. We can go to recent macro and select the new macro, and it's going to apply all those transformations to that object. And that's because I had the terrain selected first before I recorded. If I would have selected the terrain after recording, that would be programmed into the macro, and it would try to select the terrain and just keep applying that to the terrain. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is the sequence order of selections. What you can do is also set up a macro quick launch, which is going to give you the ability to add in macros from a list. You can also assign keyboard shortcuts, and that way you can access some of those commands a little bit quicker. So those are the main available options of the standalone that are not going to be available within the integrated version. So it is a good idea to familiarize yourself a bit with the standalone version.